Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Making Medicine podcast, where science, policy, and innovation meet. As always, I'm your host, John Stanford. This week, we're talking with Dr. Ned Sharpless. For the two of you out there who don't know him, Ned is a physician, entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and maybe most notably, a former federal official. He served as director of the National Cancer Institute from 2017 to 2022 and as acting commissioner of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration in 2019. Prior to government, Dr. Sharpless was director of the Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center at UNC, and today we find him investing in the next breakthroughs as co-founder and managing director of Jupiter BioVentures. Today we'll get Ned's perspective on, well, just about everything. And with that, let's get into the episode. Ned, so glad to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Well, you've got a long list on the resume, a lot of fancy titles, but the current one is with Jupiter Biosciences. I think most folks are familiar with what you're up to, but can you tell us a little bit about Jupiter and what you've been doing since leaving government?
Sure. I left government in 22, sort of after things settled down a little bit from the pandemic point of view. And about that same time, my colleague Ned David was launching this new entity called Jupiter BioVentures. And with backing from some academic institutions, as well as some traditional venture investors and strategic investors. And Ned asked me to, incidentally, another guy named Ned, it's very weird. I know one other person named Ned, and I work with him every day. But asked me to look at some of the pitch decks he was getting. So word had gotten out that he'd raised a little bit of money. And you know, as you can imagine, about half of those ideas that he was being shown were in cancer. And so he wanted some oncology advice. And, you know, after having a big administrative job at the FDA and the NCI, it was really nice to be looking at like Western blots again and doing, you know, real science and evaluating, you know, ideas at very close to the science. So I really enjoyed it. And so sort of within a week of, you know, helping Ned out with this, I was like, this is all I want to do. And he was like, well, come join me. So we, you know, launched Jupiter BioVentures. At that time, we'd sort of started a half a company. And the idea was to raise money for investors and then put those monies into new ventures. And so now we're you know, closing in on our 10th company. Many of them wind down very quickly if they don't. We have the idea is, you know, they're going to succeed fast or fail fast. But the ones that you know, progress are still going concerns. And so we think it's off to a great start. And we're actually starting to discuss raising Jupiter 2, you know, the next version of this. And you know, it's a very difficult time to be raising money in biotech, but nonetheless, we think you know, good ideas are still able to find capital and resources, and so and if you can do that, it's actually a great time to be working in biotech because there's so many phenomenal ideas and so much cutting edge science and so many great people available. So the bad funding environment has this happy side effect, if you will, that you know, good ideas and good people are not in short supply right now. So I'm having a lot of fun. I think the work we're doing is very meaningful, and I just wish the biotech investing market would pick up a little bit.
Yeah, and so the two Neds are out there just down the road in North Carolina, as I understand it. Jupiter 2, I love that. I feel like the names of your funds are going to be rivals NASA naming abilities. You talk about that tough environment, and I love that you see the silver lining of it means that there's great science out there. It means there's plenty of scientists and things to do. What do you think the cause of the bad funding environment is, and what's it going to take for us to get out of it in your mind?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. I mean, I will say the first company I started with G1 Therapeutics out of my lab when I was at the University of North Carolina, and we started that really in kind of 2008, which was possibly a worse biotech funding environment. You know, it was awful back then. You know, it was a great financial crash, and I maintain that was the secret to G1's success because, you know, people like Jay Strum, our original CSO, who had 25 years of industry experience at GSK, he was available. You know, someone like that would have never worked for an early stage biotech if it hadn't been the sign of the times. So, you know, great people like Jay and several other people that we were able to recruit to G1 in the early days were made available by the bad environment. So, you know, bad funding environments have the one happy side effect that, you know, good ideas and good people become available and are, you know, sort of in surplus. And so I think that the goal is to find as many of those and start as many good companies as you can during the bad times. And then when things perk up, in this cyclic business, you're ready to sell your ideas to acquirers or take them public or whatever is possible. But this current environment that we're in, this downturn, is a bit longer than usual. I mean, it was sort of there was relatively good biotech investing sort of in the pandemic, and then towards the end of the pandemic, things really started to slow down, and we haven't recovered since. And I think it's several things. So one is there's always the other bright shiny object that attracts capital, and clearly AI is having a moment like no other in the history of sort of tech investing. And so I think some of the people that invest in sciencey stuff, whether it's biotech or tech, have moved to AI. That's clearly one thing that we're sort of competing against, if you will. Although AI is having some happy side effects for biotech that are interesting as well. I think additionally, there's biotech is dependent on regulatory certainty, and so when things are unclear about how's the FDA going to work, or how is CMS going to cover my drug, or what's the impact of the IRA going to be, I think those things have been a bit of a body blow. I certainly in 22, when we were starting this, we would take our ideas to venture capitalists. Part of the Jupiter model is if we look at something and like it, we go and show it to a larger VC and say, if we got this to a certain stage, would you invest in it? And if they say no, then we scratch our heads and say, maybe this isn't such a good idea. And so many of those conversations went like this. We said, we have this idea of how to cure cancer. And the larger VC would say, well, is it a small molecule or a biologic? A question nobody used to ever ask. And we'd say, well, it's a small molecule. And they'd say, well, could it be a biologic? The reason being that, there's this preference in the law for biologics created by the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, that didn't used to exist. And so it's caused this perverse, weird thing in biotech that's made certain therapeutic classes more valuable than others. And so that kind of regulatory stuff, like is CMS going to pay for my drug, or is the FDA going to approve this thing in a timely manner, I think has caused some headwinds as well. And then lastly, no doubt, biotech is just intrinsically very risky. And so it needs a stable market. It needs low interest rates to really be appealing. If you can make a good return, with 7% interest rates available, you would never do biotech because it seems so difficult and hard. So, I think it's the combination of kind of the higher interest rates, the shiny object of AI, and then some regulatory uncertainty. And those three seem to me the major things that make biotech difficult right now. But, all of those things have prospects of improving. And, I'm an oncologist. You got to be an optimist to work in cancer. So I believe things will get better eventually. And the key is to, build those great companies now so that when the tide turns, you're prepared.
You mentioned something I want to stay with, but in a different variant. And that's in these times you found it was people who made G1 such a success in 2008. Tough times brought those people. People are front and center in the news in our industry on the regulatory side. You can't pick up the Wall Street Journal with something about Prasad or the FDA or the White House and this sort of Shakespearean play that's playing out. Not getting into the details necessarily of the individuals, but I'd like to take a look at your thoughts. I mean, you ran the FDA, you ran the NCI, so you actually have this unique perspective of NIH, FDA. But let's start at the top. Let's start at HHS. Obviously, the Secretary, RFK Jr., comes in with a very different viewpoint in so many ways on the life sciences side. Now that he's settled in, what consequences are you beginning to see, good or bad or neither? How has he changed HHS under his tenure?
Maybe the first thing to say about that is the HHS secretary, as a general matter, is very, very important to the NIH, the FDA, the CMS. I don't know that that's necessarily widely appreciated, how the cabinet secretary really, kind of drives the health agenda in HHS. And this administration, I think the secretaries at the cabinet level are particularly powerful. I think, the executive branch is very strong at the moment. And so the secretaries in general, not just at HHS, but at all the large departments, are having kind of perhaps, an advantage over the battle between the three branches of government. The executive branch is ascendant at the moment, I think it's fair to say, for a variety of interesting reasons. And so I think, this secretary comes in with a very different vision from, say, prior holders of that job. He's certainly I worked for Secretary Becerra when I was in the Biden administration, and and Alex Azar when I was in the Trump administration. And I think everyone would agree that RFK is a really different guy from those two, who are quite different from each other as well. I mean,
Yeah.
they're three very distinct people. But RFK has the thing he's done that has really resonated with the American public is this focus on chronic diseases and things like obesity in childhood. And he's asked a perceptive question, which is why, are so many kids overweight, and is our plan to give them all Ozempic? And, the answer is no, but nobody said that out loud. So I think, his leadership, and those sorts of things has really hit a nerve. And that's been, I think, a strong secret of his sort of success in talking about chronic health conditions at the moment. And, he's extended that skepticism to vaccines and to, the entire pharmaceutical industry and marketed products, and in a way that is, I think, resonates with a lot of the American public. And a lot of that's quite popular and politically solid. And that is then having effects on the agencies. So, the NIH has been told to focus on sort of screening and prevention and rare disease and chronic diseases, and not so much, develop, pills for therapies for, things like that. And that's appropriate. I think that, those are research areas that have not been as well supported in the past. And so I think that, a change in focus in that regard is not necessarily bad for American science. And in fact, in some ways, those are areas of science that where government is well suited to help, because industry tends to be less interested in screening and prevention and stuff like that. So it is an area where government probably could do more anyway. I think the some of the personnel actions at the NIH and the FDA have come off pretty chaotic, and that has really caused a problem there. That I was in DC the last couple of days. And it's just when you talk to people who work at these agencies, morale's bad. There's a sense that you can get fired for unclear reasons. They've lost a lot of really good expertise, just people who are apolitical, who just wanted to do their job at these agencies, who are no longer there. And so, it's unclear whether, you can really address the mission of the agency if, some of these very talented individuals are leaving. And something I've really always said and been very focused on is that in my experience, I spent basically my entire time in government at two agencies trying to recruit people to come into government. That's a big part of the job if you're NCI Director, FDA Commissioner. And it's hard. You call good people who want and say, I need your expertise. You're the only guy in the world who understands AI and, cancer data. And that's really important. And the NCI needs that. I need your expertise. You got to come work for me. And they like that. They're like, oh, it'd be fun to work for the government. I have this huge budget and it'll be great. And then as they look into it and get further down the tracks, they realize that they don't want to divest and they don't want to, give up consulting and the conflict of interest stuff. And so it's very hard to get really talented people to come into government. And when federal officials are sort of treated in what I would consider a shabby manner, of being offered, a senior person at the FDA was offered a duty posting like in Nebraska or something. And it was like, you have 24 hours to either move to Nebraska or, retire. He chose to retire. So stuff like that is just, it's not really good for morale. It doesn't help the agencies attract good people in the future. And that is probably, to me, one of the most concerning things I see going on. Now, why that's happening is, it's not totally clear. I don't think that's necessarily the secretary's fault. I think the secretary could be more forcefully speaking out in defense of these agencies, but I don't know that, it's his idea to have these HR actions occur the way they've been occurring. But I think that, while I share some aspects of the secretary's vision about focus on chronic disease and ask questions about, do we need a pharmaceutical solution for everything? I think those are fair questions to ask. I do think that the mechanics of these agencies, just making sure the right people are showing up, their budgets are adequate, they have the regulatory authorities they need, are a really important thing to focus on. And that's where I think things look troubled to me right now. So, I get asked all the time, should I take my product to CBER? Is it going to be okay when we have to go to the FDA and try and get our biologic approved? And I can't answer that question now with great confidence. I say the FDA is a historic agency that has been the benchmark for the world for decades, and I hope it will continue to be so. And there, there are a lot of great people there. There are a lot of really committed, wonderful people who are stuck to the mission. And I hope things will be okay. But when they have a new CBER director every week, it's confusing.
It really is, and confusing at some point either means a project doesn't move forward, or if the project still does move forward, it's more expensive to move forward, neither of which are good outcomes. When I think of HHS and all I loved your point that the secretary, and I don't know that people appreciate it, because a lot of people thought with RFK's nomination, well, there's only so much he can actually do as secretary versus these other agencies within HHS, and I think we've seen it can have a point. I like to remind people, the NIH is out there doing fundamental research that good ideas flow out of. Private sector often steps in to commercialize. Then you go down the hall to the FDA, who says, yeah, your thing works and it's safe. And then you go down the hall again to CMS, say, okay, we're going to reimburse this. And when it flows smoothly, we are unparalleled in the world, and we do bring the best drugs forward. And we are the world's medicine cabinet. But I think there's the more choppiness we put in between each of those agencies. And I haven't heard a lot of reporting about that. As someone who has served in multiple administrations, both sides of the aisle, but also NIH and FDA, do you have any thoughts on the liaising between each of the agencies? Has that changed at all under this administration?
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about it. I think when you talk to someone who works at the NCI, for example, right now, they're so focused on the things that are happening that they are worried about there right now that I haven't really asked that question of is the ability of the NIH to work with the FDA or FDA to work with CMS changed or different or better or worse? It's a good question to ask. There are, as you know, very important interactions among those agencies. So, for example, when I was at NCI, there was a very interesting collaboration between the NCI and the FDA related to tobacco. So there was, real scientific questions the FDA needed, the Center for Tobacco Products needed at the FDA, that the NCI could fund. If the NCI knew this was a regulatory need, they could go out and give grants in certain areas. And so that was a very useful set of interactions that I think was really important for the public health. And I assume stuff like that is still going on. I hope that those sorts of interagency collaborations are valued and prioritized. But that really is driven by the secretary. I mean, if the secretary prioritizes those things, then the agencies will work together. If the secretary says don't do that, they won't. So I think that is a good example of something where we should be paying attention. I think we've been so focused at the NIH on budgets and pay lines that I haven't really asked what else is working or not working. The one that is the interaction that has certainly gotten a tremendous focus over the last couple of years, the last decade or so, has really been the FDA CMS interaction, and should it work the same for a drug versus a device, and and now we've seen plenty of examples of FDA approval and commercial failure because of sort of coverage and whatnot, and so I think that there's been a lot of interest in could that liaison work better or differently, and should it, and my now having been through this with a few different products, my sense is it's not perfect, but I also understand why there has to be some sort of barriers between the agencies. Just like there have to be barriers between the NIH and the FDA, there also have to be some barriers between the FDA and CMS, and they have to make some of their decisions independently. But I think that is that's naturally a perfect example of the kind of thing where the secretary's goals and vision is really, really important. And I don't think I can answer yet how Secretary Kennedy feels on these matters.
I think that's right. Two things we do know that I want your gut check on. First is, like you said, tough to ask those questions when, frankly, the House might be on fire as it relates to NIH. Grants freeze, unfreeze, take them away from this university. We're not going to work with that region of the country. Here we are, many months in. What do you make of NIH funding? It seems like Congress is going to continue to back the idea that fundamental research is important. But to me, this NIH stuff is unprecedented. You probably have a better feel with your university relationships just how impactful it is. So what is the impact the last 6 months of activity at the NIH has on our researchers nationally, and what do we have to do moving forward?
Yeah, there's so many things going on, and it's really a bit chaotic. It'd be hard to, we could spend a couple hours on this topic alone to really do justice to it. But, maybe a few overarching remarks is, first of all, it is entirely fair to say, does the NIH work as well as it should? To question the structure of the NIH. And when I got up there, it was like, why do we have 28 ICs? That's institutes or centers. That's a government.
Yeah.
28, is that the right number? Should it be 29? Should it be 6? It seemed very administratively complex. And there's a lot of shared functions. Every one of those, NIHs has like its own contracting office. Do we need that? Stuff like that. So the idea you could centralize some functions and maybe reduce the number of ICs, and then another classic issue is like indirects. This is the money that is paid as support to support a grant. So basically, the direct costs you give to an academic institution to do the science, and the indirects support that. And everybody understands the concept of overhead. If you've had any kind of a budget at all, you're familiar with this sort of G&A or overhead or whatever you want to call it. And this is the government version of that, but they're quite high. In some grants it may be 70% indirects. The way what the 70% means is a little bit esoteric, but it's a lot of the money. A significant fraction of science funding now goes for sort of non-scientific purposes, and I think at some point it's a fair question to ask: is that the right number? And is this what the American public wants? And those kinds of things. So I think these topics of what the indirect rate ought to be, how many ICs ought to be, what kinds of fun topics the government ought to be funding, they're fair. That's all. That's fine. That's a debate that we should welcome, and it's also a debate, by the way, where we should expect Congress to weigh in. Congress is tell the NIH what indirects are going to be, that kind of stuff. So that's that. So I don't think we should shriek in horror and say any changes to the NIH are unacceptable. We won't put up with that. Which has sort of been a little bit of the academic reaction, and I think it's been unfortunate, because the one thing I learned working in federal government for 5 years is political capital is finite. You only have so much of it, and if you're going to freak out about indirects, then you're not going to preserve that political capital for other items where you might want it. And so I've been saying the item we really ought to focus on, those of us in academia who care about the NIH and things like that, is not some of the day-to-day churn that's gotten a lot of excitement, but it's really the top line number that Congress appropriates. And we've just seen the sort of first data point in that, and it was the Senate markup for 26, has the NIH at a modest increase, a $400 million increase for the NIH, $1 million increase for the NCI. I think everybody who's been saying in the newspaper for a year now that they expect a 38% cut to the NIH was shocked. But I think those of us who worked with the NIH were not surprised. My first budget when I was in the government was a 25% cut to the NCI. And we got a raise that year. We got a substantial increase. So Congress doesn't listen to the president in any administration, not this president or any president in my lifetime, when it comes to the budget of the NIH. They like the NIH. They like cancer research, and I suspect they're going to want to support that. So that's the thing that I think we should be most politically focused on. And some of the other questions are appropriate questions that we can discuss and debate.
I want to pivot from NIH. Let's go next door. Quick feedback on the FDA's priority review voucher program that has now come out of the commissioner's office, not to be confused with the old one out of Congress. What do you make of this? We've had some folks come on the show and sort of say, well, it kind of seems like the FDA commissioner can pick winners and losers. Is that your read? And as an FDA commissioner, is that a good or bad thing if that's the case?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting topic. My only insight here is what I've read in the media. So I've no one is really willing to tell you the details of this program beyond what reporters are hearing anonymously, kind of off the record. But I think that, and that's, by the way, in my experience, always a bad source of information. I think so. That caveat applies. Is that what all the Washington Post off the record is often semi-true. But I think it would be bad, in my opinion, if the FDA commissioner could just sort of say, I like this product and not that product, move it up in the queue, because that would be really an avenue for misuse, political interference, and all kinds of stuff. It just it would provide a number of problems for the commissioner in terms of the optics of the job, but also real conflict of interest concern. And FDA commissioners can definitely get in trouble if they, there's been plenty of past history of commissioners getting associated with specific products and really undermining the agency and their authority. So I think that I would recommend the FDA be very careful about anything that looks like it's kind of the commissioner's priority review voucher. I think that sounds kind of appealing that the executive branch could sort of pick winners and losers, but I think in actuality how that would work would be mechanically troubling. I think it's also important to note that all the other priority review vouchers, for pediatric rare disease and infectious disease and biodefense, all that stuff, that was through statute. All those things where Congress said, we're giving you the FDA the ability to do this. This would not be statutory. And also the number that was floated would be like 1 month review, which I think is implausible, right? I mean, you can't do a review in 1 month. So I think some of the details here aren't quite fitting together. I'm not sure Congress would like this. I think some company that maybe got disadvantaged by this, that didn't get this, and therefore their product didn't get reviewed in a timely manner, could sue and argue that the FDA doesn't have this authority since it wasn't provided by statute. So I think it's the iffy the legal framework to me strikes me as a little iffy. But my biggest problem with it is this perception that the commissioner's picking kind of winners or losers for political purposes. Now, having said all that, so that's all the bad stuff that worries me about it. But I think some at the FDA have tried to describe it more as, this is just the FDA being able to identify really essential products and sort of prioritizing them. This is just a prioritization thing for things that meet severe unmet medical needs, and therefore it's laudable. And in fairness, the FDA already does kind of do that. I think the inside the centers, they do have some ability to do this faster than that, and they've always tried to prioritize their resources in a way that's good for the public health. And so some have described this as just making that process a bit more formal. Maybe that would be okay, but I think how you talk about this and how you describe it is really going to matter. And if the optics are the FDA commissioner has the ability to just pick a product and bump it to the head of the queue, I don't think that would be a good look.
Yeah, and it's funny, you said, I meant to jump in earlier when you talked about RFK Jr. and how he kind of resonates with the public. I always, as sort of a creature of Washington, when I'm with people, I remind people that Washington is just a big mirror of the American public. And you don't have RFK Jr. if you don't have a lot of people questioning, like this has been building for some time. Why are rates for chronic disease going up? What's in the water? What's in the food? Why is it different in Europe? Why does that food feel healthier? Like this was bubbling and social media added to it. And so I think your point that what's resonating with the people is what we're seeing at the top. And then if you think about what you just said, hey, a drug we really need or a product we really need should move faster. If I pulled my Thanksgiving table, they'd say, absolutely. We would like to see a drug that helps people with cancer that has no other treatment move faster through this bureaucratic process than, the sixth in line eczema treatment. And so you can also just see something this administration does very well is tap it. It's very sellable, some of these ideas, even, and albeit when not all the details are there.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important to remark is that, some of the things the Secretary and the White House say may not make sense to, the faculty at Harvard Medical School. They make sense to the American public often, and that's really the source of the power, right? That, if 80 million people are, support this administration and believe we're on the right track, then that's a data point that we should listen to. And so I think that clearly a large portion of the American public has expressed skepticism about vaccines and an interest in chronic diseases and getting the food dyes out of the food. And, this stuff is manifested, as you said, is built for many years. It's not a new phenomena. And it's manifested through, Secretary Kennedy. And so that's something we should listen to. I think in some way the academic response that guy is, completely out there and he's not serious and we don't have to listen to him is the wrong response. I mean, I think that this is in some ways an indication of what the American public wants, and it's important.
So that was tremendously helpful, by the way. I think so many good takeaways on the administration. Things that are coming up down Pennsylvania Avenue on Capitol Hill. Would love your quick feedback. You mentioned already the pill penalty, and hey, that's a great drug you've got there. Any chance it comes as a biologic? Because then I'd be interested. So obviously the EPIC Act not included in reconciliation. Orphan Cures was, which fixes one of the key flaws in the IRA. The concern about small molecule versus biologic, still real, still something you think about?
Oh yeah, no, it's definitely something I think about, and I think it really is. While it's around, it's going to be driving this preference for one therapeutic class versus the other. And I like to point out that small molecules are really useful. That's like penicillin, right? I mean, there's some really good drugs, and they have a lot of advantages. They you can take them at home. They don't need infusion centers. The biologics are great too, but they have some complexity that small molecules don't. So it's really in our interest to not really have a preference in the law one way or the other, because I think we need both, good research in both classes of medicine. So I worry about this a lot. In fact, when the IRA came out, I think there were some who hoped to repeal it entirely, and I thought that was probably unwise. I thought there were aspects of the IRA that are very popular that do things that it solves, however inelegantly, the problem that some drugs seemingly never went off patent. That they had these very extended branded lives that were hard to defend, and it drove everybody crazy. Republicans and Democrats both. And so the IRA was a solution to that problem, and capping some of the out-of-pocket costs, very popular. Some of the other things popular. So I always say we should try and fix it. We should try and address those things that are the most detrimental to industry and to drug discovery and to helping the American patient. And one of those things was the orphan problem, where if you got your drug approved for an orphan designation, the IRA then created this massive disincentive to not ever seek orphan designation for anything else. And that you'll know the details better than I, but that was in part fixed, if you will, in the in the one big beautiful bill in the reconciliation process. So what's left to me, the other problem that it seems to make not great sense from my point of view, is the pill penalty, and I do hope that will get fixed. I think that would provide an incentive to for venture and people like me to work on small molecules again. It doesn't sound, if you don't kind of understand really, like 9 to 13 is that big a difference. But if you really think about drugs in general make most of their money the longer they're on the market, as doctors feel comfortable using them and they get embraced. So the last year or two are by far the most valuable. So, cutting the period from 13 to 9 years, is sort of like a 50% cut in the net present value of the asset. So, those kinds of huge, effects are going to disincentivize people. And we're only going to have biologics, and, biologics have their advantages, but, we need small molecules as well. So I think, fixing that seems like an obvious thing that still ought to happen. I believe there's bipartisan support for this in Congress. I do think that this has got a decent chance if Congress is able to pass laws and
that's a big.
If things are going to happen, then this I think has decent prospects.
That's a big if, Ned. I wouldn't normally put a guest through scientific rigor, but you are a world-class expert in oncology. I did a piece with JF over at Atlas about small molecule and the next sort of revolution in oncology. And one of his key points was that specific to cancer, there is so much that biologics just may not be able to do down the line in terms of reaching certain parts of the body, things like that. You're a world-class oncology expert. Agree with that statement that for the cancer community, we were actually kind of beginning to look back at small molecule and see what's there.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, like one really obvious, easy to understand advantage of small molecules is it's like a pill you can take every day. And so, antibodies, like biologics, you often have to infuse. Even to do that weekly is a hassle. Often it's kind of every couple of weeks. So if you need a drug to be present at a decent pharmacological concentration to provide some effect for a long period of time, like in leukemia, sometimes we do this for years. We treat now kids for AML, for ALL for like 2 years, right? you just need a small molecule to do that. There's really no way to do that with a biologic. So, so sustained pharmacologic effect is an obvious example where small molecules kind of win. The other thing where small molecules kind of win is you can kind of do them anywhere. So you can pack up a box of pills and send it to Malawi to fight malaria. CAR T cells require a complex GMP manufacture and stuff like that. So small molecules have this, they go generic. There's a very appealing feature that there's a very straightforward path to them to become low-cost medicines that can be used for worldwide impact. So we should love small molecules. Some of our best friends are, these are medicines that we've all taken and used throughout our lives, and it's not like we found them all. There are great ideas still left to be tapped. So I think that is a therapeutic class that really is important.
But big picture, how critical does IP protection, strong, consistent, transparent IP protection, how important is that to you as an investor?
Yeah, no, that's really important. That's kind of the checklist of things that you go through when you want to look at a new idea or a company to invest in. The IP is front and center. It's always like the first or second thing we consider. And can you get more IP? Can you get different IP? That's without strong IP, these ideas can't be made valuable. And you certainly see this is a consistent problem where there are problems, medicine, that we'd like to solve, but it's hard to get good IP for a variety of reasons, and so you don't see as much work in areas. So you have clear proof of the importance of IP in early stage drug discovery and development of medical products in general. So, I think that the U.S. has had a good intellectual property framework. I think the IP law and Hatch-Waxman in particular is good in the United States, and it's created a framework that I basically believe in and I think works. And the buy-dole angle that allows you to take IP from a university and commercialize that, support is really important. Doesn't exist in all other countries, and it really hurts academic commercialization. So I think the United States has hit upon a good framework that in many ways is great. And to me, the biggest threat that I worry about in this space, and it's back in the news today, is most favored nation status. So the law allows the U.S. government to sort of march. Take it back. March-in rights. So MFN is a different problem.
Well, we're going to come to MFN. Don't better believe it.
We'll probably come back to that. But margin rights is this idea in Hatch-Waxman that the U.S. government can take a piece of intellectual property if the product isn't being developed in a timely and fair way. And it had been used a lot by the drug pricing people to try. So the NIH would get a petition about every other year saying the U.S. government should take the IP for some medicine, enzalutamide.
Always Xtandi. Always Xtandi.
It goes back. I think it was even like HIV drugs back in the era, right?
Yeah.
So long and distinguished history of this, and it would be really bad to do this because if it happened one time, then it would sort of undermine all IP collectively. Anytime a manufacturer were making charging too much for their drug in somebody's eyes, in some politician's opinion, the drug was too expensive, then there would be the prospect of losing the IP and devaluing the asset. So it would be really scary. It would be bad for academic collaborations because it would provide the strongest incentive to not work with government because it's based on the pretext that the government supplied some funding for the idea earlier on. So margin rights are really bad, and now I see this as the administration is threatening Harvard University with seizing some of their IP through margin if they don't start to agree with the administration on certain issues. So I don't like margin being used for any purpose because I think once the government asserts it can do that for this reason, it's easy to do it for that reason in a future administration. So I think that would really undermine the strong and stable intellectual property framework that we have in this country.
All policymakers listening to this episode, that is what's clear. You are opening Pandora's box. And from the investment community, we will always assume there will be some risk that IP will be taken and cost goes up or people walk away. You mentioned most favored nation, this idea we would pay European prices for drugs. We have had a whole episode devoted to it. Could you even operate if we paid what we pay in Europe, or does the whole NPV go out the window if the U.S. market is France?
Yeah, this is a complicated topic, and I think, and one in which I am not an expert. I don't. I generally have this calculation when we look at a medical product and the incidence of the disease is the same in the United States as the rest of the world. So it's not like, something that specifically happens in Southeast Asia or something.
Yeah.
Calculation is the U.S. is half of the total market and the rest of the world is the other half. And most favored nation status would distort that calculus in a serious way. I think, the U.S. would become less valuable and you'd start to care a lot more about what the rest of the world would pay. And in general, prices are much lower, even in affluent countries in Europe, for example. So it may be that, certain kinds of products couldn't be profitable under that framework. Although it also may be that, certain countries that are not the U.S. could pay more for their drugs. And so it's, where it fits on the scale of bad things that could happen in the pharmaceutical industry. MFN is probably not the worst thing that could happen, but it is a serious worry. And the details of how it would be implemented and how it would be worked, is it a basket or is it truly got to be the lowest price, lower than France or whatever? Those details are really matter and of course be important. But I do think, the one thing I do understand about this is it's a political issue. The politics of this were bad. The idea, this is the one thing that drives Bernie Sanders and Ted Cruz equally crazy, is that a medicine in the United States is 10 times as expensive here than it may be in a very wealthy European country. And so that perception, that belief that occurs is bad politics. And so if we believe that this framework needs to continue to exist in this way, then I think the pharmaceutical industry has to have a better explanation for why that is. And it reminds me, the response, the political response, not the policy response, but the political response reminds me a little bit of what industry did with drug pricing. For many, many years, the industry line was, if the FDA approves it, we got to pay it. Doesn't matter what the price is, doesn't matter if the drug's valuable or not. Any approved medicine we got to pay for. That's what insurance should do. Don't think about it, yada, yada. And that was nice because that meant that if your drug got approved, you could predict the market and whatnot. But it politically was awful because it meant that, that we were committing to paying for medicines that often didn't work as well as we thought, or there was no sort of prioritization for value-based therapies or whatever. And so because industry took this hard line and refused to consider, the value of the medicines in any reasonable way, we got the IRA. And so I think that's what's going to happen here. If the posture continues to be drugs just got to be much more expensive in the U.S. than in Switzerland or whatever, then that's a tough posture to defend. And I think there has to be some solution to this that allows medicines to still be profitable, that allows to reward innovation, but doesn't ask the American consumer to pay an undue burden.
And I wonder if this direct to patient is somewhat of an off ramp. One of the GLP-1s, I forget which one. I think Lilly's, $1,000 list price, $400 Lilly Direct. Just get it straight from Lilly. That's a 60% reduction. It's not quite what the UK pays, but so I wonder if that's a pressure valve that relieves some of this and is an off ramp.
I think we should be discussing these solutions. Is there some way to? And I don't think there are reasons why medicines should be more expensive in the United States than other countries that are good. Like we have a much stronger regulatory environment. We prioritize patient safety. Getting something through the U.S. FDA is much harder than most other regulatory agencies. And the American public wants a high bar for safety, right? So we should be willing to pay for that. So it makes sense to me that the medicines don't have to be the same. The prices don't have to be exactly the same. But that we should pay some modest premium for the American imprimatur of the drug working. But so I think things like what you suggested, could direct to consumer sort of bring costs down into a more reasonable strike zone are really the right questions that industry should be asking. I think they should acknowledge they have a really bad political problem here. When you start getting bipartisan, criticism, you should listen to that.
That's the blinking yellow light for you.
When one side is mad, you can get away with it because that's the Congress can't do anything thing. But when both sides start to say, we don't like this, you should start to pay attention. And so I think that creative solutions like more robust use of direct to consumer, we should definitely be discussing.
We've got a couple minutes for two big topics. So quick reaction. The first one is AI in drug development. Are we there yet? Are you thinking about it? There's a lot of hype, but not so much yet.
No, it's extremely useful tool. Like the AlphaFold, the ability of AI to predict protein structures is a Nobel Prize winning discovery. It's a big deal. It really helps drug discovery. But it's also, it's not like you can just spit your idea into, ChatGPT and it gives you a drug 10 minutes later. I mean, drug discovery.
Let me just come up with something right now.
Right. So I've tried even asking, some of the more sophisticated ones, like, Terence Tao, the famous mathematician, said AI kind of works like a dumb grad student. And that's about where it is. If you need it to mine ideas and help you figure out, expression profile, to really analyze data, it's a helpful tool, but it's not, human level, intelligence at the moment, or at least creativity, I should say. So I think it's a very useful set of tools. I compare it to like Excel. Like, Excel is a very useful program that makes a lot of things in our life much easier, but it doesn't really fundamentally change the universe yet. And I think that's where AI is that while there's tremendous hype and a lot of promise, right now it helps with some very specific tasks, like what is the protein structure going to look like? What's the target going to bind? How's that interaction going to do? And so it does help you skip steps and speed drug discovery, and I think it also, by the way, has a very useful set of functions on analyzing clinical data on the back end. So companies like Tempus are now trying to aggregate amounts of clinical data so they can use AI to find trends in the clinical data that are hidden, and that's a really good use of AI, I think, as well. So there are some real areas where it's helping tremendously, but it's not quite up to the level of hype yet.
If AI is option 1A, option 1B is China. Some divide, I would even say, in the early stage community. Certainly lots of thoughts on Capitol Hill. How do you think about China's surging in the biotech space, and what in your view is the right attitude of how to handle that?
I mean, I think I can just make a few observations that are, I think, undisputed facts, which is, when I sort of started out as a scientist, there were lots of Chinese grad students and postdocs coming to the US and getting training, and they were very good. They were very good scientists. They worked very hard, and many of them could not get jobs in the United States. Many of them wanted to stay, but they couldn't get jobs here, and they went back to China, where they now continue to be very good scientists. And so whether it was a good idea or not, we've trained a generation of really fantastic Chinese scientists. And so now the level of science over there is really high. And the best scientists in China are working at the level of Harvard and Stanford and whatever your favorite institution is in the United States. So that means that where China a couple of years ago, it looked like most of the products were kind of Me Too. It was like we'd have a PARP inhibitor in the US, and then we'd have 7 Chinese PARP inhibitors. We still have a lot of that. There's still a lot of Me Tooism in China, but there's also original discovery now, investigator-initiated stuff that's leading to, first-in-class medicines. And you're starting to see American companies realize there's this creativity and ingenuity in the Chinese scientists and buying those assets. So we're now starting to see a lot of, kind of first-in-class assets being created in China and being brought, into the U.S. market, often through some kind of joint venture with an American pharmaceutical company. And I think, from my point of view, that's fine. If China's upped its game, then we have to do the same, and we should. At the end of the day, we're all trying to cure cancer or chronic disease for our patients, and so the fact that Chinese scientists have gotten good at this is something we should celebrate, not complain about. I do think there's been some bad stuff about the relationship that we shouldn't gloss over. There's clearly been theft of intellectual property in the past, and that still probably goes on to some extent. There's certainly things about the Chinese market that are impenetrable, these regulatory tariffs and barriers to entry and things like that. So it's not completely fair. You can develop your idea here in the U.S., but then when you want to try and sell into the Chinese market, you're forced into collaboration that isn't quite right. So I think there's some trade things that really drive the White House and Congress crazy that we should even out. And it's fair to point out that those things need to get normalized. But basically, the relationship, from my point of view, is fundamentally changed from 20 years ago. That now there's very high quality science there. There are assets being developed there that we should really take a look at. And the ability to collaborate with Chinese partners scientifically is really important to American companies. So I have a lot of work we use with Chinese CROs, and we consider clinical trials in China. There are a bunch of things about the Chinese market that are attractive. So it's a mix of some good stuff and some bad stuff, but it is the ascendancy of China scientifically is an undisputed fact, and one that we're going to have to live with in the future world.
Well said. Ned, we have covered a lot of ground. I'm so grateful that you took time out of your day. Congratulations on Jupiter's initial success. I'm excited for Jupiter 2 and then Jupiter 3 and then Jupiter 8. Any closing thoughts? And thank you again for being just stellar guest. We'll have to have you back very soon.
No, thank you for the moment to come. For the opportunity to speak. I think maybe my closing thought is something I feel like I've been saying to everybody lately, is that while it seems like a kind of crazy, chaotic environment, at the end of the day, what we're doing, trying to discover new medicines for patients and cure disease and improve the quality of life for everybody, is still something that everybody in America wants. There's uniform agreement. This is a good thing to be doing. There's broad bipartisan support for this. And so I think things like the NIH and the FDA are going to be fine, because they have to be fine, because the American public wants them to be fine, as does the Congress and the White House. So I think that while it seems a little chaotic at the moment, my advice is to, as a scientist or a doctor or someone involved in drug discovery, is kind of keep your head down and stay focused on the important mission, and all this other stuff will work out.
Thank you, Ned. Great to spend some time together.
It's good to see you guys again. Thank you very much for having me.
That's all for this episode of the Making Medicine podcast. A special thank you to Ned for joining us. Hopefully he'll be back soon. And a special thank you to the many of you who have shared positive feedback on the relaunched Making Medicine. A reminder to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can stay up to date on the world of policy and innovation. Follow us on LinkedIn, X, and Instagram using the links in the description of this video. And as always, keep innovating.